Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 549, Dog Days, Part 1. Today I want to focus on a story that is simultaneously fascinatingly and deeply interwoven with the creation of Japan as a modern state, and seemingly, but not actually, so trivial that I bet a great many of you have never really even thought about it. Research into the subject is pretty new from a historical perspective, and frankly, if someone had told me when I was still in grad school 10 years ago they were working on it, I probably would have scoffed a little bit on the inside. Is this really a good use of research funding? But life, my friends, is a process of growth, and I'm not ashamed to admit my perspective has widened somewhat with age and hopefully wisdom. And with that perspective, I can see how the development of our modern relationship with dogs could be a fascinating field of historical research. It's the sort of thing we mostly don't really think about. Growing up in the developed world, there's just a certain type of relationship to dogs that we have that is so normalized we don't really think about where it comes from. But for a lot of humanity's history, our relationship with dogs was very different. Dogs diverged from their wolf-like ancestors about 30 to 40,000 years ago during the tail end of the last ice age. Dogs were among the first species we ever successfully domesticated, and are the only large carnivores we've done it with. Cats are mighty in spirit, but less of a threat if they're not well conditioned. Of course, given the span of time involved, it's hard to say precisely where and when dog populations diverged from their wolf-like ancestors, but certainly by the dawn of recorded history, domesticated dogs were a widespread phenomenon across Eurasia. We do know that modern dogs originate from Asia, most likely Beringia in the easternmost part of Russia. However, for much of humanity's history, our relationship to dogs was pretty unchanging. Generally speaking, humans had one of three kinds of relationship to dogs. For farmers, pastoralists, and the like, dogs were working animals used for labor. Where these dogs show up in the historical record, and given how little attention your average peasant gets in the pre-modern historical record, their animals get even less, it's in remarkably unsentimental ways. They were working dogs, used for herding, hunting, and pulling, kept so long as they were useful, and disposed of once they were not. By contrast, social elites, aristocrats, nobles, royalty, tended to lavish attention and care onto pets kept almost entirely for entertainment and personal enjoyment, in other words, as non-working animals. Certainly in Japan, that held true prior to the final years of the Tokugawa shogunate. To the extent most people interacted with dogs, they were dealing with a third type of relationship. Packs of, at best, lightly domesticated animals that roamed larger cities or villages looking for trash and other human leavings to eat. If you were particularly sentimental as a townsman, you might develop an attachment to one of those dogs and feed or care for it to an extent, but you would not make it a house pet. The only exception were communities of hunters in the remote mountainous interior who might have kept hunting dogs, but particularly by the end of feudalism in Japan, those populations were pretty small. In fact, if you remember our past episode on Tokugawa Tsuneyoshi, episode 222, you might remember he was called the dog shogun for his affinity for the animals and his desire to care for them, which was considered a bit odd by the standards of the time. In Japan specifically, the only place dogs were common was among the samurai aristocracy, whose martial heritage led to many of them keeping hunting dogs that were, as the samurai class became more bureaucratic and less martial, increasingly treated like pets. When the Portuguese and Spanish arrived in Japan for the first time in the 1500s, they brought European dogs with them for the first time, though not European dog breeds. We'll get into that in a second. Those dogs made a big impression on local Japanese. Many daimyo purchased dogs or received them as gifts from the Portuguese, hoping to add the speed and strength of these breeds and their cachet as something new and exotic to their households. In fact, even after all foreigners but the Dutch were expelled under the Tokugawa shogunate, the Dutch East India Company continued to sell dogs to the Japanese. At least until the early 1700s, dogs for sale on the domestic market continued to appear on cargo manifests for Dutch ships, and the shogunate and some major domains maintained specialized kennels for breeding these exotic lines. The other side of aristocratic dog life was the Chin, or Japanese Spaniel. bred originally from dogs imported from China centuries earlier. By the Tokugawa years, Chin had become lapdogs associated with well-off women from the samurai and merchant classes, often raised entirely indoors alongside a cat, a more common type of household pet, given that cats generally do better in smaller space. Basil Hall Chamberlain, one of the first foreign Japanologists of the Meiji era, would note in his work that locals often spoke of Inu ya Chin, dogs and Chin, as though the two were distinct species, because the aggression of the hunting dog had been bred out of the Chin almost entirely, and Chin were kept in the house, where dogs never were. And again, Japan is an example of this pattern of dog ownership, but it held true in most places through most of human history. Aristocrats owned pet dogs primarily for fun, and maybe with a loose justification that they were hunting animals. Farmers and pastoralists owned actual working animals that weren't really treated differently from the rest of the livestock, and pretty much everybody else dealt with the occasional roving pack of wild dogs, which could range from a mild nuisance to a substantial danger, depending on their number and level of aggression/desperation. But then, starting in Britain in the early 19th century, our relationship with dogs began to change. The catalyst was, of course, the Industrial Revolution, which fundamentally remade British and then world society in a few different ways. But one of the biggest was the swelling ranks of the middle class, professional business types with no aristocratic background, but, thanks to the new economy, plenty of money. For many of these middle-class families, finding ways to assert their new status was very important. I'm going to quote at length here from Aaron Scabelon's book Empire of Dogs, Canines, Japan, and the Making of the Modern Imperial World, which is a great resource. I used it extensively for these episodes. Anyway, here's what he has to say. Quote, "The dog fancy provided one avenue for the new middle class to fashion a more aristocratic image for itself and changed dog keeping in at least three ways that were related to both unease about class and arrogance regarding British imperial exploits. First, the keeping of dogs primarily as pets, a practice borrowed from the upper echelons of society, spread throughout the middle class in the early 19th century. Adopting practices such as the acquisition of expensive dogs and pampering them with a variety of new products not only allowed the upwardly mobile classes to emulate the supposed sophistication of their social superiors, but also enabled them to disassociate themselves from the urban masses. Second, the invention and codification of an array of new dog breeds, especially during the second half of the century, was a sharp departure from the past. Breeders redefined a canine population that had been vaguely defined by function into an array of new defined breeds based strictly on physical appearance that were supposedly pure-blooded and possessed ancient pedigrees. In doing so, they often attempted to link their animals to the lapdogs and hounds, long treasured by the upper classes, and separate them from the vulgar mongrels kept by the working classes. A final innovation of the 19th century dog fancy was shows that put model specimens of the newly codified breeds on display. One other purpose of these shows, which proliferated from the mid-19th century, was to improve various breeds of dogs by encouraging proper breeding practices. In short, pure-blooded dogs should maintain their purity only by being bred with other dogs of the same breed to prevent being compromised by the blood of other breeds and the so-called mongrels. Now, a full history of everything Scabelon's talking about there would frankly be several episodes in its own right. For us, what really matters is not so much how this came about, but that as it was happening, the United Kingdom was also becoming the world's foremost superpower. With that newfound status and power came a great deal of cultural cachet, with British tastes of the Victorian era shaping how people around the world talked about almost everything, including dogs. Indeed, in 1933, the majority of dog breeds recognized by the English and American kennel clubs, 38 out of 70, were from the British Isles, a sign of how grounded this new dog culture was in Britain's specific history. This was all the height of the Age of Empire as well, and dogs in many ways became associated with Britain's imperial projects. Purebred dogs became a symbol of the advanced nature of British, and more broadly Western civilization, compared to the mongrel dogs of the rest of the world. For example, that information about recognized dog breeds in 1933 comes from a dog map of the world produced jointly by the EKC and AKC. Again, most of the breeds are British, and much of the rest are from Europe or the United States. To the extent that non-Western dogs were included on this list, they were generally grouped into one of three categories: wild and savage, like the Australian dingo or North American timberwolf; lapdogs, like the Pekingese, often described in very effeminate terms, as we'll see; or hypermasculinized martial dogs, like the Rhodesian Ridgeback. What I'm getting at here is that a lot of this parallels the 19th century rhetoric of colonialism, which generally grouped non-white people into one of three categories: quote-unquote savages, a term applied to many African peoples or indigenous groups in the Americas, for example; effeminate peoples, like China's scholar aristocracy, with their focus on poetry and scholarship over more manly pursuits; and the martial races, for example the Gurkhas of India, who, for a variety of interesting historical reasons, became so identified with warlike characteristics that their whole ethnic identity became wrapped up in military service. What I'm getting at here is that there is a very close relationship between the way people are talking about dogs and dog breeding as it's coming into existence for the first time, and the way people are talking about empire. But if that's very abstract for you, let's make it more concrete by looking at what happens in Japan starting in 1853 with the Perry Expedition and the beginning of the collapse of feudalism. In 1854, the Tokugawa shogunate agreed to Commodore Perry's demands that Japanese ports be opened to American ships, and as a part of the treaty process, its representatives offered Perry some gifts, only polite when someone comes knocking to sign a treaty of friendship at gunpoint, after all. Among those gifts, which included substantial quantities of rice, of course, as well as bonito, were 6 chin, or Japanese spaniels. Perry didn't keep these lapdogs, 2 of whom he named Miyako, in other words, the city of Kyoto, and Shimoda, one of the treaty ports. Those 2 he sent to Queen Victoria as gifts by way of one of the British admirals stationed in China. Unfortunately, apparently nobody actually knows what happens to these dogs. Queen Victoria never got them. #who stole the Queen's dogs. As for the other 4 chin, 3 died at sea en route back to the United States. The lone survivor was gifted to Perry's wife, Jane. It was still alive in 1860 when some of the samurai sent abroad as part of the 1860 diplomatic mission to the US came to visit her. Supposedly, it instantly recognized the Japanese visitors and came over to greet them, a sight that reduced the since widowed Jane Perry to tears. Images of the mysteriously faded Miyako and Shimoda also made it into the published account of the Perry expedition, but the artist who drew them, W.T. Peters, was based in New York, not a part of the expedition, and actually never saw one of those dogs personally, so he just made something up based on the fact that they were referred to in English as Japanese Spaniels. The resulting images look nothing like a chin at all. Despite these somewhat inauspicious beginnings, by the 1860s there was something of a vogue for chin dogs overseas. In 1865, one of them, dubbed the Japanese Rose, even won the dog show at Islington. However, the connotations of the chin were always not just Japanese, but very effeminate. Their greatest overseas devotee was Alexandria, the Princess of Wales, who was well known to be a fan, so anyone who wished to curry favor with the royals could just give her a chin. Basil Hall Chamberlain, that famous British Japanologist, wrote of the breed in his uninventively named book Japanese Things, quote, "One or 2 of them forms charming ornaments to a lady's boudoir." Somewhat more overwrought is the description of W. Rulof Kipp, an author who wrote an article in 1902 for the American Kennel Gazette on his experiences in Japan. First, he describes being bamboozled by a crafty native named Akiyama, whose name he incorrectly translates as Summer Mountain instead of Fall Mountain, into buying some chin. Akiyama tells him they're great gifts for a lady back home. Kipp then goes on to say of their bark, he calls it a yap, quote, "It is based on the best recognized type of Oriental vocal music, and if one has any imagination when they are singing, he can hear the semisen, I think he means shamisen, accompaniment, and see swaying, posturing, gaily costumed geishas, and smell that vague, peculiar odor which exhales from boxes which come direct from the Far East." In other words, this one distinctly Japanese dog breed is also being identified in this writing as distinctly feminine, a type of language that was being used to describe a lot of people from Asia during this period, that they weren't really masculine and therefore incapable of managing their territory as well as the more masculine and strong Westerners could. The other type of dog that Westerners encountered in Japan were the wild packs that roved in the cities. Here, descriptions leaned more into the savage category and less into the effeminate one. An unnamed writer for Harper's Magazine in 1855 described the dogs of the East as such, quote, "The dog of the East has degenerated below the standard of the true savage." For in this questionable position, like the half-civilized Indian, he retains none of the virtues of his original state and acquires all the vices of artificial society. In the East, says a distinguished traveler, the dog loses all its good qualities. He is no longer the faithful animal attached to his master and ready to defend him even at the expense of his life. On the contrary, he is cruel and bloodthirsty, a gloomy egotist, cut off from all human intercourse, but not the less a slave. No less forgiving was the prolific British travel writer Isabella Bird, who described the wild Japanese dogs she met as, quote, useless curs, or, more specifically, quote, a cream-colored wolfish-looking animal, the size of a collie, very noisy and aggressive, but cowardly, as bullies are. Similarly, the British diplomat Rutherford Alcock complained constantly about the street dogs of the late Tokugawa Japanese years, calling them, quote, the only real nuisance of Japanese cities, in addition to the two-sworded samurai. Many of these foreign observers imagined a sort of extreme resentment on the part of these local wild dogs towards foreigners when they encountered those street dogs who reacted very strongly to their presence. Most likely, of course, those street dogs were just reacting to the presence of a stranger in their territory, but in the eyes of Western observers, the whole thing often became indicative of a secret resentment of all Asians towards white colonials. For example, an American businessman who visited Hakodate in the late 1860s, Francis Hall, described the local street dogs as, quote, formidable with their large size, wolfish head and eyes, bristling necks and tails, but at the first sight of a Tojin, a foreigner, down droops the tail and away the animal goes to the nearest alleyway, where he stands barking and howling as you pass, and all his comrades take up the refrain and pass you along from dog to dog, band to band, street to street, until you find yourself heralded in advance wherever you go. Their very yelp seems to say, Tojin, Tojin. Robert Fortune, an English businessman who wrote an account of his visit to Edo in 1863, was even more explicit in drawing a link between the reaction of Japanese dogs to foreigners and the feelings of Japanese themselves. Quote, the dogs here in Edo were the only animals which showed their enmity to us. They did this in a manner not to be mistaken. They rushed out and barked at us in the most furious manner, but they are cowardly withal and generally kept at a prudent distance. These dogs appear to be of the same breed as the common Chinese street dog, and both have probably sprung from the same stock. It is curious they should have the same antipathy to foreigners as their masters. For however civil and kind as the natives of Japan and China appear to be, yet there is no doubt that 9/10 of them hate and despise us. Apparently such feelings are born with them, and they cannot help themselves. That we are allowed to live and travel and trade in these countries is only because one class makes money out of us, and another and larger one is afraid of our power. The poor dogs have the same feeling implanted in their nature, but they have not the same hypocrisy, and therefore their hate is visible. For these white colonials, the Japanese dog was indicative of the fundamentally uncivilized nature of Japan itself. Their main point of contrast was, of course, the thoroughly domesticated dogs they brought along, because it turns out, dogs had a big role in colonial life. As John Lockwood Kipling, the father of the famous Rudyard Kipling, put it, quote, the dog and the horse accompany the British colonial everywhere, for it is a part of our insular vanity to declare that no other dogs or horses are half so good as ours. Packs of foxhounds are regularly imported. The subaltern, the private soldier, and the civilian bring bulldogs, mastiffs, and terriers of every degree. Spaniels, retrievers, and greyhounds accompany sportsmen. The Great Danes are occasionally seen, while ladies bring such pets as Maltese, Skies, and Dandy Dinmonts and Dachshunds. In particular, Westerners headed to areas where they feared attacks by the natives or by wildlife. For example, British colonies in Africa generally brought two dogs, a smaller barking dog to serve as a guard and a larger attack dog. In places like Japan, where outside of a few turbulent years of extremist attacks on foreigners in the 1860s, the risk of being killed was a lot lower, more traditional house dogs were common. Regardless, these dogs were always thoroughly trained purebreds intended to be a contrast to the wild mutts of the uncivilized areas of the world. And as an aside here, it is important to remember the focus on the purity of a dog's breeding was, in the vocabulary of the 19th century, very tied up in the language of another area of social concern around the purity of blood: race. Now, before I get 1 million angry emails from dog owners, I am not saying that all discussions of dog breeding today are inherently racist, or dog breeds are racist, or something like that. However, it is worth noting that a lot of the same language we use to talk about dog breeds was, at the time that thinking about dog breeds was coming into vogue, also used to discuss race. As Aaron Scabeland puts it, quote, "Race, the categorization of human beings into groups according to distinctive physical characteristics transmitted by descent, and racism, the application of those assumptions into practices designed to control, exclude, or eliminate other racial groups, permeated the 19th century imperial world. In the West, people had been constructing hierarchies based on evolving notions of race since at least the 18th century. By the end of the 19th century, many people considered race to be a central part of individual and group identity, and used science, including concepts derived from animal husbandry, to sanction unequal political and social relations in the imperial world. Though now largely mutually exclusive in their linguistic deployment, race, breed, and blood once acted as synonyms, and were often used interchangeably to refer to both humans and other animals. People routinely spoke of races of dogs, savage breeds of people, and pure-blooded humans. From the late 19th century, the science of animal breeding was influenced by, and in turn helped to shape, social Darwinist thought and eugenics ideals, and contributed to heightened national anxieties about preserving and improving the racial hygiene of both humans and beasts. You can see that reflected in how foreigners living in Japan talked about their own dogs in relation to the native ones. The same Isabella Bird who wrote disparagingly of Japanese mongrel curs struck a very different tune in relation to a dog she met in the British legation in Tokyo. Visiting that legation, she was ushered into a classically English home, complete with servants, quote, "two real English children," as opposed to fakes, I guess, are those Welsh children, and, quote, "a beautiful and attractive terrier named Rags, who unbends in the bosom of his family, but ordinarily is as imposing in his demeanor as if he, and not his master, represented the dignity of the British Empire." To be fair to Bird, Japanese people seeing these animals appeared to be just as fascinated by them as their owners. For example, the artist Utagawa Sadashige, also sometimes known as Hashimoto Gyokuransai, produced a text in 1862 called Yokohama Kaiko Kenmonshi, or roughly, Report of Things Seen and Heard in the Open Port of Yokohama. Yokohama was, by this point, the largest of the treaty ports open to foreigners in Japan thanks to its position near Edo, modern Tokyo, and Utagawa's report provided a chance for curious Japanese to learn a bit about what life was like in these strange places where the foreign barbarians came to reside. Utagawa was an artist by trade. As his last name indicates, he was a member of the famous Utagawa school of ukiyo-e artists, of whom the most famous is Utagawa Hiroshige, and so his report is a mixture of text and images in woodblock print form. Where dogs appear in those prints, they are overwhelmingly very large and appear to be a type of pointer or greyhound, in keeping, of course, with the perceived need for larger dogs to ward off danger in uncivilized lands. In one particular instance, Utagawa describes a foreign butcher preparing beef, something that, as we've covered in past episodes, was not really part of the Japanese diet in 1862. Thus, the butcher drew a substantial crowd of curious onlookers. Quote, "Because of all the chit-chat and commotion caused by the bothersome crowd, the foreigner, as only he could do, sicked about 10 strange-looking dogs loose on the onlookers. Some of the dogs were smooth with bag-like hanging ears and panted heavily through large open mouths. Others were black and looked like lions, and still others looked like chin. When the people saw this dark swarm with their open red mouths coming at them, they turned pale and started running, and the dogs chased after them. They cleared the entrance to the butcher shop. Fortunately, no one was bitten. When the people fled, many of them dropped their pocketbooks or lost their sandals, and these things lay in the middle of the street. They dare not return to retrieve them, out of fear that the dogs milling around the shop would bite them. Just then, 3 foreigners came down the street, and recognizing what was happening, they stopped between the dogs and the fallen items, and motioned for the people to quickly grab their things. It was just as if the Buddha had rescued them from hell. Everyone recovered their belongings and scurried away as fast as they could. Beyond this specific instance, Hashimoto seemed very taken in general with the closeness between Westerners and their dogs, writing at another point that, quote, when foreigners are at home, a dog is laying around the house, and when foreigners have gone out, one can be sure if they are at home or not by determining whether a dog is present. Of course, it makes sense that that would be weird to him. Again, outside of the elite levels of the samurai class, nobody kept dogs as pets in Japan in a way we would recognize today, other than the Chin, which of course are not very large. Foreign residents in Japan remarked on all this as well. The French illustrator Georges Bigot, during his time in Japan from 1883 to 1899, regularly depicted foreigners with their dogs in his drawings of life on the islands, and only rarely showed a dog in an image with a native Japanese. And of course, he would be paying attention to that. Well, in Japan, he kept a beagle named Akka, or Red, who appears constantly in his work. In one image, Akka is even being carried down a mountain by a hired Japanese servant after taking ill. In a separate letter to his mother back in France, Bigot described the consternation of that hired servant, quote, "The man went pale, fearing that he was going to be eaten by my dog, and asked me stridently if he had anything to worry about. When Akka sniffed at his ears and the nape of his neck, he shook with fright. After we had traveled about 1 league, he liberated himself from the burden, and with great pleasure took the dog off his back and handed him to his partner, whose turn it was to carry him." And I mean, what an image. To be honest, as a kid I didn't like dogs that much, but even as like a 6-year-old, I have a hard time imagining seriously thinking a beagle would pose a threat to me. But it's important to note here that this unknown Japanese porter and those like him would basically have never interacted with dogs like this before. To be fair, not everyone was terrified. Lawrence Oliphant described his time working in Shimoda, one of the first 2 open treaty ports, as the private secretary to Lord Elgin, the 8th Lord Elgin, son of the guy the Elgin marbles are named after and one of the first British diplomats in Japan. In Oliphant's discussion of the natives of Shimoda, he said, quote, "They manifested but little curiosity at us as we strolled about the streets, but I was amused to observe a crowd collected around a dog belonging to one of our party, of the Shantung Terrier breed, and which, though purely a Chinese dog, is scarcely to be distinguished from a Skye Terrier. This long-haired specimen of the canine race created immense excitement and interest, both among Japanese dogs and men, as he trotted complacently along the streets of Shimoda." 10 years later, one Mr. Barrow, an employee of the Yokohama-based J.C. Fraser and Company, took it upon himself to trek from Yokohama to Miyanoshita, a village in Izu about 77 kilometers to the west. That's quite a trip on foot in its own right, and also it's 1868, so there was technically a bit of a civil war going on, yet Barrow made it without incident, and in recollecting the story to the English-language Japan Gazette 40 years later, gave most of the credit to his companion, a large black retriever named Jack. Quote, "Jack was a constant source of wonder and delight to the villagers of all ages, who of course had never seen a dog of the kind before. He proved to be a sort of passport to their goodwill because of his good temper, obedience, and docility, in spite of his huge size." And again, it makes sense the Japanese locals would be surprised, and either afraid or curious, or a mix of both, about the dogs brought to Japan by Westerners. The notion of a purebred dog was foreign to this region, as was the idea of a dog that lived so closely with owners. Remember that according to Basil Hall Chamberlain, Japanese speakers at the time spoke of dogs and chin, the smaller lapdog spaniels popular among wealthy women, as though they were different species. A big part of that conception was probably that chin, unlike dogs, actually lived around people in close proximity. For their part, many of the Westerners living in Japan and elsewhere in Asia often drew contrast between the civilized nature of their dogs and the local canines or even local people. One of the most fascinating examples I found was from the British missionary Bernard Jean Bettelheim, who set up shop in the Ryukyus from 1846 to 1854 in order to try and spread the word of God, taking advantage of the legally ambiguous status of the islands and his status as a foreigner to skirt the anti-missionary and closed country edicts. He was not very successful in his missionary efforts, partially due to local circumstances. The Ryukyuan government carefully monitored his activities and probably put spies in his household, and partially because his temperament was, well, let's take a look. Tensions eventually burst into the open after Ryukyuan authorities accused Bettelheim of sicking his 2 dogs, gifts from friends in China before his departure, quote, 1 very fine pointer, and a second dog, somewhat of a Newfoundland and Chinese breed, a tried and true watchdog, on 2 Ryukyuan assistants who he probably correctly thought were spying on him. In a verbose letter of complaint to the Ryukyuan government, he wrote, quote, "The matter is, the literati envy the cleverness and politeness of these dogs, for the whole country is seeing how well-behaved these dogs are, plainly understand that it is not enough for a man merely to honor his parents, love his offspring, and obey one's master, so much dogs are also able to learn. But man must pray, worship God, and take care of his soul. This cleverness of my dogs is why the mandarins brought forward an accusation against them. These dogs always accompany me. They never run before, but always follow their master like a servant, and they, when with the master, never dare to bark or bite at any, not even a fellow dog. The whole country knows this, and therefore admires these dogs. How can the government thus say the dogs ran or were driven and bit people? I am the teacher of this country. The rules of propriety have to proceed from me. My alms are dispersed among the poor people. I walk among them like Confucius. I teach the ignorant populace how they may obtain everlasting life, with the only exception of the mandarins. The people of Luchu, Ryukyu, praise our conversation and religion. How can you say our dogs ran and bit people? Now, there's an important element underlying that and really all these narratives that we've touched on, but I really want to end today by emphasizing it. These notions of cur local dogs contrasted with pure European ones is representative in a lot of ways of scientific, from the perspective of a 19th century European, understanding of how the world works. Because in the mid to late 19th century, the notion of racial science, race purity, and a social Darwinistic competition between the races of humanity for power and survival had a lot of academic currency. This is the thing I think we can forget sometimes. These views about the fundamental difference between races, which are in fact just phenotypic, they're just appearance, were considered cutting-edge science. This was not a fringe position. Scientific racism was mainstream. So much of the conversation among Westerners around the undomesticated dogs of Asia involved discussion of how these dogs had clearly degenerated, how they had, thanks to the uncivilized nature of the people themselves, fallen from the grace of civilization and pure breeds into a mongrel amalgamation of different dog races, which of course played on the fear of race mixing itself, as with the dogs, so potentially with humans, who after all exist in their own essential race categories that must be preserved. If that's a bit academic, I think the simplest way to boil it down is this. The worldview of the 19th century was very entwined with notions of race that it was both fundamentally real and unchanging, and that some races were just better than others. If you start from those racist assumptions, it will inform everything about your worldview, including something as simple as what you see in a dog. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com. Special thanks to our beloved patrons, Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, John, Christopher Harrison Reese, Ino Enrio's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, Jennifer Pianzio, James, Brenner Podgurski Smith, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish I Catch Are, Rhodes Scholars Compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed When the Fire Nation Attacked. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for Part 2, as we look at the evolution of how dogs are being talked about in Japan during the Meiji years.